When a young woman begins to experience horrific visions, daymares, during her waking life, she will seek help from her parents. Believing the matter to be spiritual, they consult a priest who tries to drive multiple demons out of her body. However, ultimately, the exorcisms would fail. The result of which has created one of the most compelling and yet controversial cases of the 20th century and possibly ever. Today, we will be examining the life and death of a young woman named Anneliese and the 6 demons that supposedly took her. This is the untold story of the exorcism of Anneliese Michel, and what a terrible and truly horrifying story it is. Before I begin this dark and extensive story, there's a few things that I would like to say. Whether this is a true case of demonic possession or the result of malpractice due to religious extremism is not up for me to decide. I will simply present the case as chronologically accurate and full of detail as I can, and ultimately, the conclusion is up to you. So let us first start at the beginning. Joseph Michel, who had served in the military during the war, was thankful to have returned to his family's small village following his imprisonment by the Americans and sequential release in late 1945. Having seen the horrors and ravages of combat, he thanked God that his small village of approximately 3,000 souls hadn't been attacked during foreign army occupation or the devastating air raids that leveled most major cities in Germany. He would be reunited with his family and would assume a job within his family's business. And during this time, he would meet a woman named Anna, a local girl, and within 2 years, the couple would be married. Born as Anna Elizabeth Michel on September 21st of 1952 in Leipzig, Bavaria, West Germany, Anna was a very shy and somewhat sickly child as she grew up. Michelle was raised along with her 3 sisters as very religious, and as a family they would all attend Mass twice a week. And although frequently sick, she was known for being very sweet, but also very shy, usually keeping to herself and her studies while at school. All was going well for Anna, who had become known by the name of Anneliese, a combination of her first and middle names. This was until she turned 16 years old. Shortly after her birthday, Anneliese had a moment where she fainted in front of her younger sister, and upon her sister calling her name and poking her in the arm. When she came to, she believed that she was just exhausted from studying too much and decided to lay down for the night. But that night, little did she know that her torment would begin. As she slept in her bed, shortly after the clock had struck midnight, Anneliese would awaken in a panic, as a giant force, as she would later describe it, was holding her down. She felt the area around her indent, as if a very large person or creature was sitting on top of her. This entity then began to press on her stomach, which caused her to urinate. Panicking and unable to breathe, the poor woman called out to God in a desperate attempt to stave off whatever this thing was. Convinced that she was dying, she pleaded to be freed. However, upon the nearby church clock tower sounding the quarter hour, it was all over. All pressure had ceased, as if it was blown away by a wind. Whimpering in terror now, Michelle changed her linens and would barely sleep that night. She would inform her mother the following morning that she felt very ill and was exhausted, and who can blame her? So her mother allowed her to stay home from school. Nearly 1 year later, during the day of August 24th of of 1969, whatever it was, decided to strike again. Just as what had happened before, she had blacked out earlier in the day, and later that night, right after midnight, yet again, she felt the familiar but terrifying large force begin to hold her captive yet again. She was unable to breathe and unable to call for help. Again, she would be freed by the tolling of the church clock bell tower. Upon informing her mother of this second incident, her mother was unsure of what was happening to her poor daughter, so she decided to take her into the family physician, a man named Dr. Vogt. At the recommendation of Dr. Vogt, they would board a train to Offenburg to meet with a neurologist by the name of Dr. Siegfried Luthi. Dr. Luthi that day would run a variety of tests, all which would come back negative, and unsure of the results, he asked them to return on August 27th for a follow-up appointment and more tests. One of the tests ran upon their return in August was an EEG, which recorded normal alpha-type brain activity. Coming up yet again empty-handed, the doctor still had to account for the convulsive episode that his patient said she was experiencing. So he diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, and from here, she'd be placed on a drug known as Zintrapil, an anticonvulsant. And this worked for a time, but as 1969 would progress, she would become very sick. In December, she would contract pneumonia, which would be further complicated by a tuberculosis infection. She became too ill to further attend her studies and was forced to drop out of school at that time. She would remain back at home in her bed until January of 1970, at which point her condition still hadn't improved. So as a result of this, she was transferred to the hospital in February. From here, she was placed in a sanatorium in Middelburg, one that specialized in bronchial and lung disease. She made some improvement there, but would also have other issues diagnosed. When spring came, she longed to go home, to see the beautiful lush hills of her village, instead of the jagged and ominously gray mountains that surrounded her. Unfortunately for her sake, she was not yet permitted to leave, due to her condition still needing to improve, as well as new diagnoses of cardiovascular circulatory problems. Although sad, Michel understood what was happening. However, this all too persistent and familiar force that had come to plague her would visit her yet again on June the 3rd of 1970. The same massive, paralyzing entity would grip her with ice-cold and unseen hands. This time, however, Anneliese tried everything she could to free herself, and in her desperate attempts, a lone scream would finally manage to tear loose from her lips. And this scream was heard by the night nurse, as well as the young doctor that was on duty that night, both of which rushed to her aid. As the two entered the room, the specter released its grip on Michel. By this point, all of the commotion had woken up the other girls in the wing of the sanatorium that she was in. Michel would be assisted with changing her pajamas and bedding, and tried to sleep under nurse supervision that night. The following morning, the girls' gossip had reached a fever pitch. They began to speculate if Anneliese had previously had a head injury, or if she had water on the brain. Anneliese herself, however, didn't pay much attention to them. She was becoming withdrawn and was still weak from the previous night's episode. She was more concerned with what was going on with her health. As the day progressed and dust settled on the horizon, while the other girls were headed to the cafeteria, Anneliese opted to stay in her room, stare out her window, and say her evening rosary. As she prayed, the voices of the returning girls seemed louder than usual. However, what once appeared as massive and foreboding mountains appeared more beautiful this time. Their peaks glistened with pink and violet as the sun hid them. One of the girls would approach her as she was admiring and praying and would ask if she was all right. She then would comment on her blue eyes being black Anneliese, unsure of what to make of this, shook off the girl's remarks. She would go on to finish her rosary. The following day, she would be sent to another specialist who would attempt to figure out just what was going on inside of her head. After a day's worth of tests, including EEGs yet again, they would find no evidence of anything being wrong. However, with her now documented history of epileptic seizures, the doctor, Dr. Keller, would recommend a new anticonvulsive drug be prescribed to her. Upon returning to the sanatorium, Anneliese would begin to experience a new and terrifying manifestation. In her normal waking life, she would begin to see horrible, demonic-looking creatures that were seemingly stalking her from the shadows. They would appear in the mountains, in her corridors, and even in her room. Upon seeing their gnarled faces, she would often fall to her knees and beg the Virgin Mary for grace to make these terrible visions go away. After 6 more weeks at the sanatorium, she would be examined once again by a physician, and again have more tests ran, and yet again, she would be found to have no abnormalities in her brain scans. With this conclusion, she would finally be allowed to return home to her family. Her return home was happy at first, being back in her own bed, surrounded by familiar faces. But yet Michel found herself soon worrying about going back to school and readjusting, and of course, about her persistent health problems. However, she would end up returning to school to finish. This time, of course, she would be visited by multiple doctors all throughout the year to monitor her health. She would have several more seizures, although seemingly not as severe as the ones previously experienced. And although those had seemed to be pretty minor, she was still experiencing horrific, disfigured visions. She began to share this with her mother, and after time and time again of the doctors not finding anything abnormal about her, Anna began to think that something supernatural was taking place. One evening, the 2 parents discussed this matter in particular. Anna tried to convince her husband that what was plaguing their daughter was of the devil. She told him that Anneliese had been seeing horrible and twisted faces all throughout the day and night, sometimes in the mirror, or looking out a window, or even through the faces of other people. One vision in particular that Anneliese had relayed to her mother disturbed her so much that she had to share it with her husband, Joseph. Anneliese had told her that upon seeing the statue of the Virgin Mary in their living room on their mantle, that her eyes turned black. A hideous grin appeared on her face, and her small, delicate hands began to twitch and then morph into thick, grotesque claws. Seeing the sincerity in his wife's eyes, Joseph, although silent for a few minutes, decided that the family should ask for guidance through prayer. With school finally finished for Anneliese before university, a summer trip was in order. After consulting with the doctors about his daughter's condition and discovering her depressive thoughts that she had shared with them, Joseph decided to take his daughter to the shrine of San Damiano in Italy, in hopes of not only aiding her spiritually, but hopefully mentally as well. The shrine had been created by a woman named Rosa Quattrini, who over time experienced multiple miracles and received messages from the Virgin Mary, including to have the shrine built. Later becoming known as Mama Rosa, she would work alongside Padre Pio for many years. So in due time, with the assistance of a teacher, they organized a trip to the shrine and were on a bus headed through the Italian countryside. Upon their arrival and exiting of the bus, amidst the beautiful vineyards that surrounded the location of the garden in which the shrine was located in, a dark presence would envelop Anneliese. Surrounding the shrine was an open space which allowed for pilgrims to kneel and pray. A small crowd was present as Anneliese approached the shrine at the insistence of her father. However, she seemed like she couldn't approach the Holy Mother. She began to walk around the shrine in a wide arc, and to her feet began to burn, as if she was walking on hot coals, and each person she glanced at, although in the praying position, were gnashing their teeth, and their faces were distorted and awful. This is where she began to really first display her aversion to holy objects, such as medals of saints, statues, and insignia that represented Jesus Christ. Those present couldn't help but notice how strange the young woman was behaving, and upon heading back onto the bus, she was then being asked by the teacher, a woman named Frau Hein, about what was going on with her. She expressed that her will was not her own, and that someone else was manipulating her. Almost as soon as those words left Michel's mouth, her personality would completely change. In a voice that sounded like a man's, Anneliese began to belittle Frau Hein, making fun of her for being unsure of herself. She then snatched a blessed medal off of her neck. Simultaneously, Frau, Joseph, and others present on the trip began to smell a stench exuding from Anneliese, unlike anything they had ever experienced before. The smell was that of fecal matter and something burning, and it permeated the entire bus. She would eventually calm down, and the occupants would return back to their native Germany. After their visit to San Damiano, Anneliese seemed to feel quite well despite what had taken place, but this would only last for about 2 weeks. She was set to attend college for the first time in several weeks' time, but felt that she was in no condition to do so, and she complained to her mother that she was horribly depressed and constantly plagued by these horrible faces. Believing it to be a result of her daughter's seizures, Anna would make an appointment with Dr. Luthi. Several days later, Anneliese would troop to that very appointment. It would be determined that she had been seizure-free in between their appointments together, and another EEG would determine that her brain was indeed normal. However, Dr. Luthi, who was non-religious, would essentially belittle Anneliese for telling him that she was seeing these horrible visions on a daily basis now. He believed, personally, that she was an overly superstitious Catholic girl, and with this, he would clear Anneliese to go to university. This would be the last time that she would see Dr. Luthi, and the last time she would mention the demons to any medical professional. Becoming more depressed and withdrawn, her mother would finally confront Anneliese, telling her that her whole life she's wanted to be a teacher, and now that the opportunity is here, she's not taking it. Anneliese would explain that she was depressed, empty, and tired, that the drugs were not helping her, and that the demons and their manifestations were only getting worse. Still considering her daughter's issues to possibly be spiritual in nature, Anna would arrange for her to begin meeting with priests in an effort to aid her. The 2 priests that would begin to receive letters from both Anna and Anneliese were Father Herman and Father Alt. After reading the letters, their interest not only piqued by the descriptions of what poor Anneliese was experiencing, but Father Alt began to feel very ill, seemingly out of nowhere. After this happened, he would retire back to his dormitory room for the night and would try to sleep it off. Shortly after the clock struck midnight, Father Alt would awake, soaked and in a cold sweat. A storm raged outside. Lightning illuminated the room around him. As he laid in his bed, feeling awful, he began to pray. But as he prayed, he would feel someone or something press on his bed as if they had walked onto it. This deeply frightened the father as he jumped off his bed, began to pray out loud. As the words left his mouth, a horrendous, burning smell began to fill his room. Alt then rushed out of his door and into the hallway. His vision began to narrow, and his color perception was changing as he rushed down the stairs and headed toward the exit door of the building. Within the shadows cascading on the walls and the stained glass that surrounded him, horrible, distorted faces began to reveal themselves. Father Alt now knew that what he was dealing with was indeed very real evil forces. He would run outside and into the rain, falling to his knees and gripping his rosary as he attempted to catch his breath. He would eventually return back to his room once he felt that the force had passed. However, the scent of burning fecal matter still filled the entire parish. Even the following day, it was still there and would be experienced by all of the priests and staff. This event would further the interest in Anneliese's case and further motivate the priests to act quickly, fearing that the young woman was indeed being affected by the demonic. Father Alt would begin to meet with Anneliese when he could, and it would accommodate her school schedule. At this particular point, she seemed to be doing fairly good, despite still seeing the manifestations most days. She would begin classes on November 1st of 1973, going to lectures day in and day out, and seeking various churches and chapels to relax and pray in as she remained a diligent student. And her life, despite these awful visions that bothered her still, was about to change. At the end of November, Anneliese would meet a fellow student by the name of Peter. He was somewhat like herself. He was very shy and friendly, but was outgoing when you got to know him. The two shared many classes together and would soon fall in love. Several weeks into their relationship, however, Anneliese would tell Peter to stop seeing her, fearing that when the demons came back, he wouldn't want her anyways. But despite what his new girlfriend was telling him, Peter denied this and still refused to leave her side. Soon after this, Anneliese would go in for a checkup evaluation, where she would have an EEG yet again, except this time, the doctor administering the EEG, a woman named Dr. Schleip, would find patterns of epilepsy. This is significant because this is the first time out of all of the other times that any patterns of epilepsy had ever been found. As a result of this, Dr. Schleip would change Anneliese's medication to yet another anticonvulsant drug, known as Dilantin, in hopes that it would improve her condition. Following this appointment, Peter and Anneliese would continue their relationship, in which Anneliese would confide in Peter more so about what she was experiencing with the demonic figures and faces that still plagued her. Peter had also become aware of the awful stench that seemed to follow her, especially when she was experiencing these supposed hallucinations. And as their relationship progressed, he wanted her to join him in meeting his family and friends, but Anneliese refused, worrying that they may not be as understanding as Peter. Michel would ultimately express that she did have moments of clarity where she did feel like herself, but every so often, those devils would reappear. Despite taking her medication daily, rigorously, the faces would remain. And soon, coupled with the faces, she would begin to experience debilitating headaches. Father Alt, checking in on her with the local bishop there on campus, would discuss that her complaints and ailments continued to be the same, despite her taking her medication every single day. He would arrange to have Anneliese meet him in a nearby town for the two to pray together. Peter would ultimately take Anneliese to this appointment and would be surprised at how quickly she seemed relieved after the two began praying. Although very skeptical, Peter began to believe that possibly this could be a spiritual problem. I did want to take a moment here and say that there's so much information about what happened to Anneliese in her life, and I've been pretty thorough up to this point, but I'm going to do a few briefer sections leading up to the paranormal manifestations that worsened her life, just because if I sat here on every painstaking detail, we'd be here all day. Following the meeting with Father Alt, Anneliese's depression would return. She told Peter that the clanking of knives and forks sickened her, that the demons wouldn't let her eat. Coupled with her losing weight and becoming ever more reclusive, other witnesses to the strange behavior she exhibited began to grow as well. One incident in particular, a mutual friend of both Anneliese and Peter, named Anna Liepert, witnessed something that she would never forget. In July of 1975, with Anna, Anneliese, and Peter sitting in Anneliese's dorm room, having a casual conversation, suddenly, out of nowhere, Anneliese's face contracted and contorted into something demonic in appearance. Her entire body then went stiff as a board, as if she was entering a catatonic state. Obviously freaked out by this, Anna asked Peter what was happening, and Peter simply replied, "It's the demons. She's under possession." Not knowing what else to do, the two prayed with Michel, and it would take an hour and a half for this episode to be over. Following this happening, it became clear that Anneliese could no longer be by herself and attend school. The two would reach out to her parents, and several days later, they would move the young woman back to Klingenberg. Upon arriving, Anneliese was able to start eating again, but her other problems continued unabated. If anything, they worsened greatly in a very short period of time. During a phone call between Father Alt and Michel's mother, the two would be interrupted frequently by the horrendous screams of Anneliese in her room, screaming obscenities and overall acting abhorrent. Father Alt would ask a fellow priest closer to Anneliese to assist him in aiding her spiritual battle, a man named Father Roth. Upon reaching out to the family to arrange his meeting with them, Father Roth was surprised when Anneliese's mother answered the phone and said, "Father Roth?" The two had never met before, nor had she been previously informed that Father Roth was going to call. Bewildered, he said, "Yes, that's me." He was then informed that Anneliese had told her that he was going to phone. That right there to the priest was an indication of the demonic, knowledge of the unknown. He would arrive a week later, and upon entering the house, he could hear the girl scream from her room above. A horrible stench, like something burning, like dung and sulfur, filled the room that he and Mrs. Michel chatted in, the main living room of the house. Trying to find the source of the scent, he checked all the other rooms. He checked outside, in the kitchen, everything that he could think of, and yet he could find no explainable origin for this horrible smell. Mrs. Michel would inform him that Anneliese had been in the living room roughly 20 minutes before his arrival. Stepping outside to avoid the scent, the two would chat further, and Father Roth would be informed of Anneliese's outbursts of rage and all around her bizarre behavior. The family would beg him to pray over her, to which he agreed. Reluctantly walking upstairs to Anneliese's room for the first time, he couldn't help but notice the abnormal amount of dead bugs that lined the hallway. Upon opening the door, he would be besieged by the girl. She began cursing at him, screaming at the top of her lungs, telling him to not dare take the crucifix out of his pocket, which he had not told anyone that he was carrying. She ran out of the bed and up to his face, suddenly stopping an inch or two away, as if she was frozen. Her eyes blackened, and she said, "Oh, priest, you may try." She then collapsed to the floor in a catatonic state. This was more than enough for Father Roth to rush to arrange a meeting with Father Alt to discuss what exactly had taken place. Within 2 days, they would meet in person, to which Father Roth would explain that he had no doubts that the girl was being troubled by demons, that he had no doubt that it was indeed the real deal. Therefore, the two together would seek to move forward with a formal permission to begin the exorcism process. During the wait for the final set approval, the course of the next year would weave a web of disgust and horror as her family, Peter, and the priests would experience a plethora of horrendous manifestations at the hands of Anneliese. Following Father Roth's initial visit, Anneliese had become extremely restless. At most, she was only sleeping 1, maybe 2 hours a night. She would run through the house on all fours, barking and screaming like an animal. She would visibly be forcibly moved by something that she couldn't see. During her prayers, which were constant at this point, she would do knee busters, standing up and kneeling down at the expense of her knees. No matter how awfully she injured them, they were becoming swollen and ulcerated. She would nonetheless continue to do this, having to be moved back into her bed by Peter and her family. Alongside the ever-worsening madness, weighing 100 pounds at most at this point, she began to exhibit superhuman strength. Peter would watch her crush an apple with one frail hand and throw her sister Rosvitha across the room like a rag doll. She also began to smash her face into walls and floors, leading to her mother placing pillows all around in an effort to stop her from injuring herself. With the Michel family's world turning upside down, Anneliese stopped eating and drinking altogether. Normal food, that is. She began to stuff the overabundance of insects into her mouth, eating roaches, hordes of flies, and spiders. Further, her behavior became more unhinged. She began to chew on coal and rocks, which ultimately broke several of her teeth. Among the chaos, her family began to experience what can only be described as paranormal manifestations themselves. Clouds of flies would appear and disappear at random all over their home, and in the dead of winter, they began to see shadowy figures that would be running all throughout their home and watching them around every corner and out of the corner of their eyes. This, of course, would deeply frighten them. As Anneliese raged on, her family and Peter took to alternating 2-hour shifts in order to take care of her to the best of their ability, in an attempt to prevent her from inflicting more wounds upon herself. Joseph knew things, given how awful they were, could not continue the way that they were going. So he soon, out of desperation, phoned Father Alt and began begging for his assistance. Father Alt, who had been in touch with his superiors at the church, would inform him that he believed Anneliese should be admitted to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. However, upon sharing the slew of details that were shared with him by Joseph at the dramatic worsening of Anneliese's behavior and overall condition with a fellow priest by the name of Father Rodvik, Father Rodvik agreed to go and see the girl for himself. Upon entering the Michel house, he would be introduced to Anneliese through her father, who had walked her into the living room by himself on account that she had become very violent towards herself and family members by this point. Sitting down beside her, Father Rodvik asked her, "What is your name?" Her response, in a very low, altered voice that was not her own, was Judas. Over the course of the next several hours, the father was able to have a normal conversation with Anneliese, as she went from being under an outside influence to herself having no recollection of the latter. Then, towards the end of the meeting, she would slap the father across the face and then stand up, walk towards the piano, and begin playing it as if nothing had ever happened. Father Rodvik informed the family that he would indeed help her and support them, and that he ultimately believed Anneliese to be possessed and would seek action immediately. After much deliberation, the church finally came around. A priest by the name of Father Renz, an experienced exorcist, would be tasked with the ritual, and on a cold and rainy day, it would begin. September 24th, 1975, he would arrive at the Michel residence. After discussing the plan with her family, he would proceed up the stairs and walk into the viper's den that was Anneliese's room. He would be joined by Joseph, Peter, and a volunteer from their local congregation who wanted to assist. At first, all was quiet, even silent. Anneliese, or rather the demons, were not engaging Father Renz, but when he began the ritual, he sprinkled holy water on Anneliese, and she began to shake and scream. She started to bite the men who were holding her, lunging at the priest. She attempted to attack him. It would take all 3 additional men to hold her down. We draw what we know what happened from an entry in Father Renz's diary. He would go on to say that she would sound like a man, speak Latin, and eventually be reduced to a catatonic state, following an all too familiar pattern from what we already know. Knowing that he had a long battle ahead of him, the priest was saddened that the first ritual had not been successful. He would leave for the night, but would ultimately return 4 days later on September the 28th in the evening. He then brought with him a recorder in hopes of providing a record for future study within the church. Due to this decision by Father Renz, we now have some of the most disturbing audio I've maybe ever heard, and I've heard a lot of crazy stuff. This is just a portion of what he recorded.
ja, ich will auch für die anderen leiden, damit die nicht in die Hölle kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar, nee.
Ihr Klötze! Nein, ihr Klötze!
Kind Gottes.
Ich hab ein Moderschlag!
Namen des Vaters,
Anneliese would again repeat the chaotic behavior that was exhibited within the first exorcism, and the devil that resided within her began to rebuttal the priest in Latin, as well as her native tongue of German. Although being familiar with the Latin language, Anneliese was not fluent, let alone fluent enough to have been able to rebuttal a priest in real time who spoke the language fluently. As the priest inquired as to why the girl was being tormented, it, whatever it was, replied with, she was cursed before she was born by a woman, a neighbor of her mother. Anneliese's parents and Peter would later check this story out, but the woman had since passed away, so they weren't able to come up with anything conclusive. This second exorcism would last for hours and would end with a haunting sentence from Anneliese herself. She would say, "Damned for all eternity." She would then curl back up into a catatonic state, like a statue. Now, we only have some details here and there based on the diary entries, interviews, and audio recordings, but this would ultimately continue for months. Anneliese would undergo 67 exorcisms in total. She would reveal that she was possessed by 5 demons, and their names were Cain, Judas, Nero, Fleischmann, and Lucifer, the devil in the flesh. There is one more demon, but it's a name that I feel like if I say it on YouTube, I will probably get demonetized. You can look it up for yourself. Just simply go to her Wikipedia page, which I will also be linking down in the comments below. Cain, known from the Bible as the first murderer, the originator of violence. Judas, as in Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed Christ. Nero, the crazed Roman emperor who tortured Christians for his own sick enjoyment. Fleischmann, who was a disgraced priest local to the land. And finally Lucifer, the Prince of Darkness himself. Her physical decline due to not being able to eat, self-inflicted injuries, and psychosis due to lack of sleep would finally take their toll. She would inform Father Rentz on June 30th, at the end of what would be their final exorcism, that she had spoken with the Virgin Mary and that she had agreed to stay on earth and suffer through the demons to prove to people who didn't believe in God that the devil was very real. She would then ask for absolution, in which Father Rentz would grant her. That night, she would go silent for the first time since all of these horrifying episodes had began. And the following morning, around 7 a.m. on July the 1st of 1976, she would be found dead in her bed. All of the exorcisms and attempts to drive the demons out had failed, and upon her death, she only weighed roughly 85 pounds. Anneliese had gone from a shy but happy girl with her whole life ahead of her to an emaciated shell of herself. Just how did we get here? Was it malpractice? Was she mentally ill? Or was it truly the hands of the demonic that snuffed her out? After multiple calls had been made by her grieving family, a man named Dr. Keller would perform the post-mortem examination, and it's important to note the following details because honestly it's really intriguing. Her death was determined to be caused by starvation and possibly aggravated and tremendous physical exertion in the final weeks of her life. he would find that her inner organs surprisingly were healthy and not damaged, as well as her brain, which showed no signs of epilepsy, not even on a microscopic level. Curiously still, no bruising, bed sores, or ulcerations were found on her skin. In the ensuing aftermath, the priests were arrested and charged with negligent homicide, as well as Joseph and Anna. The trial and case overall would become a highly debated issue among the German people of the time, with some being convinced that she died at the hands of Satan himself, and others that it was the fault of malpractice on behalf of the priests and her parents. The trial would last for months, with doctors weighing in with their opinions, lawyers, witnesses, and just the whole works. And although I have those details here, there is so much to it, just the trial itself, that honestly I would probably have to make a whole other video in total just to cover it. The verdict, however, in my opinion, is the important part of what followed her death. After a much heated debate, ultimately, Michel's parents and the priests involved would be charged with negligent homicide and would be sentenced to 6 months in prison. The 6 months ultimately would be reduced to 3 years of probation, as well as a fine, given the unique circumstances of the case. The church would draw a ton of heat as a result of what happened. They would ultimately retract the confirmation that Anneliese Michel was indeed possessed. Michel had been buried under hurried circumstances, and as a result of this, as well as multiple religious people sharing that they had visions of her body untouched by decay, she would be exhumed almost 2 years later, with the intention being to have her buried in a nicer coffin. Her family and friends were discouraged from viewing her remains because they were consistent with the decay of a corpse of that age. In the end, her case would go on to achieve worldwide notoriety and would force the Catholic Church to all but never issue sanctioned exorcisms. And on June 6th of 2013, the home in which her exorcisms took place in mysteriously caught fire and would burn to the ground. The police suspected arson, but never ultimately proved it, but many locals believe that it was a result of what had taken place there. And really, it's hard telling. Decades after her death, her story would go on to inspire multiple films and books, including The Exorcism of Emily Rose, being the most popular, and honestly fairly accurate with some liberties to the original story. And of many of those books, the best and most utilized resource of them, for me, has been The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel by Felicitas D. Goodman. All, and I mean all details you could ever want about the entire case are available in this book, and I would highly recommend it. In conclusion, Anneliese's case remains a terrifying and mysterious one. Was she demonically possessed or incredibly mentally ill? Did her priests and parents genuinely help her in being freed from Satan's grasp? Or did they contribute to the end of her life accidentally? Really, the final conclusion is yours to make. But regardless of the cause, I'm glad that her suffering is over, and I pray now that she can hopefully rest in peace. Thank you guys so much for watching this new video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, subscribe with notifications on, and if you're already subscribed, go ahead and turn notifications on. It helps me out a ton. Please also leave a comment letting me know what you thought of the story, your thoughts on basically a newer format I'm trying out. I'm trying to do kind of like a half and half thing. I'm trying to find ways where I can speed up making content for you guys and just try and find a happy medium and get you guys more content and better content. So let me know what you think for sure. And I highly appreciate your feedback. This case took a really long time. I mean, probably like 2-3 weeks to research. And I really hope that I did Anneliese's story justice. And I hope you guys learned some stuff that maybe you wouldn't have known before or otherwise. Anyways, I appreciate you guys. I love you guys. And I will see you next time. This has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Remember to stay safe out there and take care.